understood in this country, because people running around calling themselves socialists and talking about socialism occurring, but they don't talk about socialism as the negation of what? Capitalism. You don't have coexistence between socialism and capitalism. So socialism is a negation of capitalism. And to negate capitalism is not to negate an idea. It's not to negate high prices in your grocery store, right? So anyway, let's look at the New and the Old, chapter 9. I'm going to read this rather quickly, if I can. I do want to try to get to chapter 10, and I just really want to advise people to study this, to look at this, and to also review the remarks that I made introducing this, and go back to the political report to the 6th Congress, and the political report to the 7th Congress. So the struggle of opposed forces which constitute the driving force of development does not take place accidentally, but on the basis of internal contradictions inherent in the very nature of the processes concerned. There arises a contradiction between the new and the old. That which is arising and growing contradicts that which is dying away and disappearing. That which is arising and growing contradicts that which is dying and disappearing. And this fact is strikingly exemplified in the development of society. In the process of development, the new grows strong and overpowers the old. And this leads to the forward movement of development, in which each stage is an advance to something new, not a falling back to some stage already passed. Since development proceeds by the overcoming and supplanting of the old by the new, it follows that development can only proceed by the negation of the old and not by its preservation. And that's an important statement, especially when you look at the crisis of imperialism, and people find themselves trying to protect the empire, protect imperialism, not recognizing that this crisis is beneficial to us. It is an instance of the old dying out, and what has to happen is that the old must be supplanted by the new. And you can't do that by trying to preserve the old, which is what most of the liberals and so-called white leftists are constantly involved in doing. Contradictions inherent in things and processes, internal contradictions. In the last chapter, we consider how qualitative change is brought about by the struggle of opposed forces. This was exemplified equally in the change of state of a body from liquid to solid or gas, and in the change of society from capitalism to socialism. A state of a body from liquid to solid or gas, that is water heated, can turn into a gas in form of steam and what have you, and then cool can turn into a solid in the form of ice. In each case, there are opposite tendencies at work, whose struggle eventuates in some fundamental transformation, a qualitative change. This is a qualitative change. We talked about the difference in qualitative and quantitative change. Quantitative change being a change in degree, faster, slower, hotter, colder, etc. Where qualitative change is a change in the actual state of something from liquid to gas, or liquid to solid, as we talked about heating and cooling water. The struggle is not external and accidental. It is not adequately understood if we suppose that it is a question of forces or tendencies arising quite independently the one of the other, which happens to meet, to bump against each other, so to speak, and to come into conflict. No, the struggle is internal and necessary, for it arises and follows from the contradictory nature of the process as a whole. The opposite tendencies are not independent the one of the other, but are inseparably connected as parts or aspects of a single contradictory whole. And they operate and come into conflict on the basis of the contradiction inherent in the process as a whole. Now, here, a lot of the Marxists, and perhaps most of them, have a problem and would fight and struggle perhaps against us when we say that these opposite tendencies are not independent one of the other, inseparably connected. And we say before then that it's not adequately understood if we suppose that it's a question of forces or tendencies arising quite independently the one of the other, which happens to meet, to bump up against each other, so to speak, and to come into conflict. Now, the question is not them coming into conflict, it's becoming the transformation. It's like, when Marx talks about the primitive accumulation of capital, from his perspective, from his view, this turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, or the attack on China and the Opium War, etc., is something that developed its basis was for the development of capitalism and the development of Europe. But what has happened is that it is no longer, and this is something that Marx misses, yet he touches on, because now he says this is the primitive accumulation of capital, right? He said this is the primitive accumulation of capital. This is what gives rise, birth to the capitalist system itself. If it gives birth to the capitalist system itself, then they are no longer separate entities acting in some casual relationship one to the other. Now it's a new social system that has come into existence. Do you see? And that's fundamentally important. If we want to work out the laws of dialectics and what have you, it's fundamentally important to understand this. So, and this is something that Marxists have not come to grips with, have not come to terms with, because it's not been necessary for them. Up until now, it's necessary because we have to solve the problems in society. And Marx, as genius as he was like everybody else in Europe, was moving to try to solve the problems in European society, resulting from the end of feudalism and the emergence of a new social system, and the absolute need to be able to explain the existence of the social system and place and destiny in that. So a new social system, a new explanation, a new narrative, a new basis, a philosophical basis has to emerge, and Marx is one of those forces who offered up such an explanation. Now here we are, trapped in this relationship that Marx referred to as the primitive accumulation of capital. The primitive accumulation of capital is a statement that's been made by Marx and others who are defining the development of Europe, of European capitalism. Do you see? There's nobody who's in Africa who's saying we are now part of a primitive accumulation of capital. There's nobody in China who experiences the Opium War as the primitive accumulation that gives rise to capital. Something is happening in China. Something is happening in Africa as a consequence of this, but it's only those who are the subjects of history who define this relationship, and the subjects of history have been Europeans since the advent of colonial capitalism. Anyway, so no, the struggle is internal and necessary, for it arises and follows from the contradictory nature of the process as a whole. And the process is contradictory as hell. Now the process is not exactly what they thought it is. The process is one that has locked the rest of the world into this parasitic relationship with Europe. That's the new process. It is not a goddamn process that's happening somewhere in Manchester, in England, or among the imperialists. The process as a whole is this new relationship of parasite and host. This is the primary contradiction in the whole world, the relationship between the parasite and the host. And capitalism is a parasite that has come into existence and rests upon the body of humanity. I hope I'm understood. The opposite tendencies are not independent the one of the other, but are inseparably connected as parts or aspects of a single contradictory whole, and they operate and come into conflict on the basis of the contradiction inherent in the process as a whole. But how often do you hear the discussion talked about as a process as a whole? They talk about the crisis of capitalism as something that has to do with overproduction in the United States or something like that, or some other stuff, or in Europe, etc., but the process as a whole. Africa is ignored by, I mean, when you look at what the bourgeoisie and what the Marxists, etc., Africa is ignored. Some of the people who I respect most as these brilliant intellectuals and what have you, they don't even count Africa in the equation. Africa is 1.5 billion strong in terms of the whole population of Africans, and in Africa itself, more than 1 billion people. I mean, the concentration of the extraordinary wealth and resources of the world located there in Africa, but it's not even counted. It's been counted out of history. So thus, in the opposed tendencies which operate in the course of the change of state of a body operate on the basis of the contradictory unity of attractive and repulsive forces inherent in all physical phenomena. And the class struggle which operates in capitalist society operates on the basis of the contradictory unity of socialized labor and private appropriation inherent in that society. And this is where, see, this is a fundamental contradiction, because this is where the Marxists see the primary contradiction as existing between the socialized labor and private appropriation inherent in capitalist society. But Marx has already said that wage slavery in Europe, which is capitalist production and development, requires as a pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. So the primary contradiction cannot be that which exists on the pedestal. The primary contradiction has to be that which exists between the pedestal and capitalist activity that rests on it. Do you see? So this dialectical understanding of the internal necessity of the struggle of opposed forces and its outcome based on the contradictions inherent in the process as a whole is no mere refinement of philosophical analysis. It is of very great practical importance. I'm going to read this quickly because I'm going to try to see if we can get to something in chapter 10 as well. Bourgeois theorists, for example, were all able to recognize the fact of class conflict in capitalist society. What they do not recognize is the necessity of this conflict, and that it is based on contradictions inherent in the very nature of the capitalist system, and that therefore the struggle can only culminate in and end with the destruction of the system itself and its replacement by a new, higher system of society. So they seek to mitigate the class conflict, to tone it down and reconcile the opposing classes, or to stamp it out, and so to preserve the system intact. And that's what we see, even with forces who we're working with on a regular basis. They don't want the class contradictions to express itself, to expose itself, to make it to the surface so that it can be targeted. They want to find a way to reconcile the interests of the various classes. They want to find a way to reconcile the interests of the African people with the existing social system. In fact, people will come up and say, well, don't you think that, and that did come up to me and say that, we know Bernie's not everything, but isn't that a good start or something to that effect? Because that's the preference. Reconcile this stuff. Find a way to reconcile it. Don't be, trying to overturn it. And especially what's really frightening, and this is not something that is easily immediately understood, is that the white left is as afraid of the African working class as the bourgeoisie, and sometimes more afraid. And so the whole notion of African workers, in the streets, taking power, looting, burning the goddamn cities down, the white left is as afraid or more afraid of that than the bourgeoisie is afraid of that, and will stand, you will not see the white left that will say, free all the African prisoners, turn them all loose. Or free the Black Liberation Army. And they would say things like free Chelsea Manning. And they would say things like free the other person's Assange, but they won't say free Sundiata Acoli. They won't say free the Black Liberation Army. Why? Why is that? And then they will frown upon us if we do not, with the same amount of enthusiasm, say free Assange, or if we say, hey, what about Sundiata? Somehow we are breaking up the unity, something to that effect. Of course we want Assange to be freed, and we want Manning to be freed. And I shouldn't even have to say some stupid stuff like that. I mean, the African liberation movement has never been for locking up people who've taken some kind of stance as minor as it is, because the only thing that Assange and Manning did was take a stance in defense of democracy, constitutional democratic rights. So the Black Liberation Army, on the other hand, fought to overturn the whole damn system, the whole damn setup. And that's one of the things that distinguishes them. And then that's historically associated with overturning the system has been blackness. First, you're going to overturn the slave system. That's everybody's existence, all the white people's existence, state of well-being and what have you, requires slavery. And here you come. Not only are you talking about overturning it, you're saying kill the slave master. And of course, you wouldn't have to say kill the slave master if those who consider themselves, who are part of the slave master society, would abandon slavery and then join on the side of those who are enslaved. You have to say kill the slave master. Excuse me, comrades. Anyway, I don't know how, I mean, we can understand this, and we have to understand this. We have to explain this. We have to capture a dialectical approach that is accurate in its assessment of our relationship to the world. So, so we say that bourgeois theorists, for example, are well able to recognize the fact of class conflict in capitalist society. What they do not recognize is the necessity of this conflict, that it is based on contradictions inherent in the very nature of the capitalist system, and that therefore the struggle can only culminate in and end with the destruction of the system itself and its replacement by a new higher system of society. So they seek to mitigate the class conflict, to tone it down and reconcile the opposing classes, or to stamp it out, and so to preserve the system intact. And precisely this bourgeois understanding of the class conflict is brought into the labor movement by social democracy. We say the labor movement because most of the Marxists saw class struggle is something that manifests itself through trade unionism, etc. In its opposition to such a shallow metaphysical way of understanding class conflict, that Lenin, it is in opposition to such a shallow metaphysical way of understanding class conflict that Lenin points out, quote, the main point in the teaching of Marx is the class struggle. This has very often been said and written, but this is not true. Out of this error here and there springs an opportunist distortion of Marxism, such a falsification of it as to make it acceptable to the bourgeoisie. The theory of the class struggle was not created by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx, and is generally socialism that distinguishes itself